After weeks of silence, we're learning new details on the state of trade talks with the U.S., pulling back the curtain on what it could take to ease the trade war. Industry sources tell CBC News that Canada is pushing for a few key things from the Trump administration, demanding no new 50% tariffs, the one set to start August 19th. It wants sectoral tariffs on steel and aluminum to be lowered, and a public announcement that a CUSMA review and those talks are getting underway. To help get there, Canada is willing to offer a few things. Some changes on dairy quotas, making it easier to sell U.S. goods in Canada. An end to provincial booze bans that are still in place. Lift retaliatory tariffs placed on the U.S. auto sector. And cooperation around defense, energy, and critical minerals. In the meantime, both countries have agreed to hold daily meetings up until that August 19th deadline for those higher tariffs. For more on this, Brian Clow is a former Deputy Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Mr. Clow joins us from Toronto. Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. I want to start by asking you, what do you make of what we've learned about the Carney government's strategy here when it comes to the negotiations with the Americans?
Well, the government is doing what it should be doing at this moment, facing the very significant escalation in tariffs from the Trump administration a couple of weeks ago. The deadline is a couple of weeks from now. They're getting in there, they're talking, they're trying to find landing zones. And this is hard work. I am not at all surprised to hear that they are planning daily meetings for the next 2 weeks, all the way up to August 19th, because the set of issues is so broad. They've got to get in there, work through them line by line, item by item, and try to get to a resolution.
One thing that was shared after these briefings took place is that insight into what Canada is willing to sort of give up in this moment when it comes to, making concessions. It is a negotiation. There is a back and forth there. Do you think realistically there was any way the Canadians were going to get the Americans to take these talks seriously if they weren't willing to come to the table and sort of give some things up?
In order to get to an eventual deal, all sides are going to have to put some water in their wine, and that includes the Americans. And my understanding is part of the message of what the Canadians are saying to the Americans is, if you want Canada to make a bunch of one-sided concessions, that's not going to work. That'll be judged as a bad deal that the Canadians will have to walk away from. So I'm not surprised the Canadians are offering to accommodate the Americans in some places, particularly on the alcohol issues, for example. But we're going to need to see some movement from the Americans if we're going to get to any sort of resolution. And so the Canadian push to get real relief on the 232 tariffs that apply to steel, aluminum, autos, it makes a lot of sense that that's what Canada is pushing for.
I want to talk about momentum in just a moment here, but when it comes to some of those concessions that sort of we know that have been discussed behind closed doors, some of them, that term, that phrase might not be popular with Canadians who are frustrated with the Trump administration and are mad that this trade war is even happening in the moment. But we know that the premiers have been very firm in saying that the booze bans remain in effect until the tariffs go away. How difficult might it be for the Carney government to get the premiers to play ball on this kind of thing, given the public statements by the provinces?
You've pinpointed the exact most critical issue in my mind and what could be the ultimate obstacle to a deal here. Because the Americans have said publicly, and the Canadians have in different public forums confirmed this, the Americans have said they're not going to reduce the 232 tariffs to zero. And we have several premiers saying unless those 232 tariffs go to zero, they're not going to put booze back on shelves. So this is a real problem if we're going to see an agreement by August 19th. And I'm sure the federal government is having conversations not only with the Americans, but with the provinces in real time to see if something can be cobbled together here. If there's going to be a deal to avoid the escalation in tariffs, certain premiers may have to settle for a 232 tariff that is close to zero but not quite zero. And we'll see if that's where we land on August 19th.
If you were advising Prime Minister Mark Carney, as you did advise Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, would you advise him to urge the premiers to drop the bans if it could lead to a deal?
Certainly if it can lead to a deal. And that's, I know, what the Canadian government is working towards right now. Whether we get there, that's the big question mark. This period we're going through right now, it reminds me a lot of April, May 2018, When we were renegotiating NAFTA with the Mexicans and the Americans, the Mexican election served as a deadline, much like the deadline we're now seeing on August 19th. It was forcing a lot of conversations, a lot of different work. We were parked down there. Chrystia Freeland, Steve Verheuvel, various Prime Minister's office staff were parked in Washington for 4 straight weeks trying to get to an agreement. Ultimately, though, even with that forcing deadline of the Mexican election, we didn't get there, and we had to walk away from the table. The Americans walked away from the table, and everything stalled. So it's good that the countries, or Canada and the U.S., are talking right now. We're going to see a lot of sustained energy up to the 19th. But I'm certainly not betting that it's all going to come together on the 19th. We'll see.
I was going to say, how would you assess, is it too early to sort of assess what the chances are, do you think, based on what we know so far, of whether there can be some kind of landing zone to have Canada avoid even more tariffs by August 19th?
I think it is too soon to tell. As I said a moment ago, there's a lot of energy, a lot of work going on. But ultimately, come August 18th, 19th, when it's clear what the set of issues are and where they've landed, the Carney government's going to have to judge, is this a good enough deal? They've said repeatedly, and they're right to say this, that they won't accept a bad deal. So if the Americans aren't willing to put some water in their wine and we come to the 19th, we could very well see talks break apart. And frankly, at this very moment, my judgment is it's more likely there won't be a deal than a deal on the 19th. But this is a very fast-moving, fluid situation, and we're going to have to see what happens.
You are one of a very few Canadians who knows Jamieson Greer. Jamieson Greer was part of Robert Lighthizer team, who served in the role before he took this on. There was, of course, the Biden administration in between there, but you know him. What should Canadians know about Jamieson Greer and who the Canadian team is up against right now?
Well, he's a smart guy. He's a tough negotiator. He was there throughout the NAFTA negotiations as Bob Lighthizer's chief of staff, as you say. And so Canadians should know that he is pushing for Donald Trump's agenda. He agrees with that agenda. He's pushing for it. And frankly, that should be his job as the USTR.
I was going to say, of all the members of Donald Trump's cabinet, he is one of the most serious, with the most experience in his particular field. And I think that for the Canadian government, that might ultimately present an even bigger challenge, because he is such a serious and sort of, knowledgeable, authoritative figure when it comes to this file. And whereas some other folks might not have necessarily had the experience going into some roles, he did with the time and energy on the ground before. Brian, if you were to give advice to any businesses that are waiting for certainty and don't know whether they should make any hiring decisions or investment decisions, what kind of advice would you give to them?
Well, my main piece of advice, and a lot of businesses doing this already, is pay close attention to what happens here, especially in the next 12 days, as decisions are made on both sides of the border. If you're in an industry that's in focus by the Americans, or you're currently facing tariffs that are in place or threatened tariffs, decisions that are made in the next 12 days could either support your industry in a big way, or you could get harmed. So you got to be paying close attention right now and working your contacts and speaking to the government.
And before I let you go, is there anything in this moment you think that Canadians are not necessarily tuned into right now and we should be paying attention to? What will you be watching for going forward?
Well, what I'm actually watching for is what we talked about a couple of minutes ago, is what's going to happen with the premiers. And they will have some real choices to make here. I've already mentioned Doug Ford. He said booze won't go back on shelves unless 232 tariffs go to zero. The Premier of BC, the Premier of New Brunswick have said they won't move on alcohol unless softwood lumber is addressed. So depending on where this all goes, the decisions of those premiers are going to be pretty critical here, because the Americans have said they won't do a deal unless booze is back on shelves. So all three entities, the federal government, the U.S. government, and these premiers are going to be needing to talk to each other pretty consistently over the next 12 days.
And we, of course, will be watching. Brian Clow, thank you for your time.
Great to be here.
We have new details about some of what's going on behind the scenes with Canada-U.S. trade talks. Sources tell us the federal government is prepared to make concessions, including asking provinces to put U.S. booze back on the shelf, but only if the Americans meet some of Canada's demands. Earlier in the show, we asked Ontario Finance Minister about that.
Our resolve is firm to keep U.S. liquor off the shelves until we see the details of a comprehensive deal. We want to see that, and then, of course, we'll come to the table and give the response.
The office of the Quebec Premier also put out a reaction saying the removal of U.S. products from the SAQ shelves will remain in effect until an agreement that we deem fair has been negotiated. The sale of alcohol falls exclusively under the jurisdiction of the government of Quebec. It is Quebec and Quebec alone that will make this decision. Time now for the Power Panel. Jonathan Callis was a Quebec advisor to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Ginny Roth is a former Conservative campaign strategist, and Marika Walsh is a senior political reporter in the Globe and Mail's Ottawa bureau. Jono, I'm going to start with you. What do you make of what we may see from the provinces, that statement there from the Premier of Quebec's office? Is this going to be a major obstacle if the Canadians say to the Americans, okay, we'll lift the ban, but the provinces might not be on board?
Do you think there's an election coming up in Quebec with that statement and the way the last two sentences are there about how it's up to Quebec, it's Quebec's jurisdiction, and they're the ones who are going to decide? I mean, that's pretty standard, but you could tell the sort of upping the ante. I would say I'm not particularly surprised by any of what we're hearing is being negotiated. It sort of sounds reasonable in terms of it was never going to be a perfect deal. There was going to be give and take. We don't really know what this will look like. You know, I trust the sourcing of the stories, but we don't know what a final deal will actually look like. We just, these are things that are on the table that are, open for discussion. How far and how wide it goes, I think we're still far away from that. And, Brian Clow said at the beginning, he's not going to bet on actually a deal before the deadline. So, I think this is demonstration that there is some movement. But on the other hand, this is also, I think, preparing Canadians for the fact that we're not going to go back to where we were a year and a half ago, where there were no tariffs at all. This is sort of an interim step, and we'll see where things go.
Ginny, one thing that Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, had flagged earlier this week is that he is concerned that Canada has made too many concessions and that it was whittling away its sort of bargaining power. Do you think that the reporting that we've learned today, that perhaps that might be something that he'll sort of seize on as he criticizes how the government's handled the Canada-U.S. relationship?
I think so. I mean, Jono gets at the challenge for all the politicians involved. The politics is very different from the reality. And that challenge is much worse for the Prime Minister. These premiers get to, whether they have an election soon or an election down the road, they get to make this entirely political because they're not the ones that have to do the deal. And they love the politics of playing tough. The Prime Minister loved the politics of playing tough during the election campaign, but now that he actually has to come up with a deal, that doesn't work for him, right? He has to compromise. So I'm glad to see it. I think it's good. I think there need to be compromises. But I think he eroded that position when he was doing all of that theater for all those many, many months in the lead up to becoming Prime Minister and then ultimately through the campaign and then now that he's since Prime Minister. And I think that's going to be the point that Poilievre's going to try to make is you can't have it both ways. You can't say your elbows up, get the political theater, get the political benefit, and then also be the person that's compromising. Not included in this reporting because it happened earlier, or maybe it was, but not as part of the deal, was coming off on the DST. All these sort of concessions that the Prime Minister made up to this point, where we heard, oh, maybe we're going to get a deal now. The Americans have asked for this. We're going to do it. Those concessions already happened. We can't get those back. And now we have fewer and fewer things on the table to play around with. And we know that the PM doesn't want to move really far on supply management, so maybe he's willing to make some tweaks. So I'm curious to see what is beyond the reporting that we've already seen, because we also know that the president drives a hard bargain, and he's not likely to settle for sort of going back to the status quo.
Marika, it was the Globe and Mail that first broke this story this morning. I'm just wondering what stood out to you from the reporting that your team has done on this as well.
Well, we have more reporting and updates coming tonight, and I think what stands out to me is that, as Ginny and Jono mentioned, the Prime Minister will have to make concessions in this, and it wasn't part of his branding coming into office. And public opinion polling shows it's not where Canadians are. The Prime Minister's office has not done a lot of groundwork laying in terms of setting expectations for Canadians in terms of the concessions and the possibility for pain as part of this deal. It has been very close to the chest what that means. And so that leaves, I think, Canadians in the dark. And it leaves a question for me politically as to how they now sell this to Canadians. But one of the things we're starting to hear is that a baseline across the board tariff is part of the talks on the broader USMCA. I'm sure that doesn't come to you as a surprise, Katie, but the fact that people are now acknowledging that, I think, is really significant. And it leads to more questions about what else. Again, this is early. Talks are still ongoing. They're changing by the day. So who knows where this lands? But we are hearing more and more from Canadian officials that some form of tariff is going to be here to stay.
Yeah, so our reporting also has that American officials, they have expressly said to the Canadians, as long as Donald Trump is the president, there will be some kind of tariff that is involved here. Right now, we understand it to be around the 232 tariffs and the steel and aluminum. Those are not going to be going away. But the question is, can the Canadian team get those lowered? Our reporting has been through industry sources that the Canadians want to be able to go out there publicly and say, we have the best market access to the Americans, and want to be able to hold on to that and point to that factually. So they want a lower rate than what others are doing. But it's, Jono, how difficult is it, a point that Marika made, how difficult is it going to be for the Carney government to try to sort of sell this as a win to Canadians when it is going to have to come with concessions?
Look, we've gotten this far. We're 14, 15 months into the Carney administration, and Canadian public opinion seems to have followed along as things have evolved. And I think there's probably a general understanding, I don't think that far into the weeds, but a general understanding that getting the best deal possible, getting a deal that is an improvement over the current situation, not the status quo before all of this, but the current situation. So if it's reducing the 232s on those core industries, if it's having a baseline tariff that's low and lower than any other country, yes, he's going to have to sell that as this is the best deal possible. But if we compare it to other countries, and if in fact that's the case, we stand in a better position. Canadians so far have gone along with that, and I suspect they probably will. It'll depend on really where the pain points remain and where, we'll be able to figure out who's really paying the biggest price, which industries, which sectors, where they are geographically. So that's the political perspective, how they sell that to each of the different sectors, workers in those industries, businesses, all of that.
Ginny, what do you make of, in this moment, while there appears to be so much momentum, but again, it seems to be sort of mixed messaging about, is there the possibility that they can get to a landing zone? What do you expect to hear from the Carney government as this goes forward? Do you expect that Canadians will be kept up to date, or are we going to have more of this sort of behind the scenes secret, leaks coming out eventually? Are you expecting there to be more transparency at this point?
Well, there's sort of two dynamics. There's that dynamic you described where the government is keeping its card close to its chest. And there's also the Trump factor. Mm-hmm. We keep, as Canadians, in our reporting and our coverage and our analysis, wanting to revert back to a normalcy where this is how trade deals are negotiated. This will be the next phase. They'll come to a landing spot. Donald Trump doesn't come to a landing spot, right? As many liberals have told me over and over about how Trump's word isn't worth the paper it's written on. So are we to accept that when they reach a landing spot, that means that this time Trump is for real, and only to have him a week later be offended by someone or put off by something or get a call from someone and change his mind, right? So I think the government is cognizant of that. I think they're savvy and they understand that, and they don't want to declare victory too early. I actually worry that with some of this reporting, they may seem to be declaring victory a little bit too early, only to have things sort of messed up as they go along or confused or put off. I didn't hear Brian Clow's comments, but I think he's probably right that betting on a deal anytime soon is probably unwise. I certainly wouldn't. And so they have to be really, really careful about this. And if I were them, I would not overpromise. The business community really, really wants certainty, and I just don't think they're going to get it in the way that they hope for. And the government has to be really careful how it communicates so it doesn't raise expectations too high.
Ginny raises a super interesting point about the ability to trust an agreement with Donald Trump when we've seen him not sort of abide by the deals that exist. Marika, do you think that there needs to be a conversation in Canada, whether it's among the business community, among voters, among the government? Does there need to be a realistic conversation about whether this is the right moment to sort of continue on with pursuing CUSMA? Do we need to have a bigger, broader conversation about whether this is even worth it?
we unfortunately need it. And so there is no other option. And the Prime Minister has acknowledged that himself in the change of tone, change in message. He's gone from last year's election campaign to a speech in New York where it was about making America great again with a Canada strong. That is an acknowledgement that we need this North American fortress they are now talking to. And so they are forced to play on the playing field that Donald Trump has set. And that is just the state of play. I think it's really important to note and emphasize everything that we're hearing, your reporting, my reporting, all the reporting we're seeing, all shows that this is not a return in any way to normal. Canada is making concessions for less pain, not no pain. They are concessions to have still some form of tariffs. It's just not as bad. And to the question of the premiers that you started the conversation on, Donald Trump, for all his faults, is smart. The 338 tariffs that are threatened to come in a week and a half target BC, Ontario, and Quebec. So if those premiers say, no, our booze ban stays in effect, then those same premiers are looking at a 50% tariff that decimates some of their key industries. And so he has them cornered in many ways. The Prime Minister says there are positions of strength that Canada has. He keeps those cards close to his chest. So we're just seeing what's in public. And I would say, these are flashbacks for you more than for me, Katie, but they are much more careful in what they share and what they leak privately or even what meetings they acknowledge compared to the last round that we saw in 2016, 17, 18.
Or where they will speak to the press or not doing it.
Or whether a minister was at public events that are later socialized on Instagram. Yes,
there you go.
It's quite the trip.
There you go. Okay, we're going to pause the conversation there on that issue, but I'm sure we'll be talking about it so much more.